All right, welcome back. This is going to be Chapter 10's lecture on global poverty and wealth by James, I don't know how to say this, Arvanitakis and David Hornsby. All right, we'll skip the intro, jump right into section 2, and talk about some of the reasons, some of the issues with the history of poverty, inequality, all of these sorts of things. So we know globally and historically there has been a history of exploitation by rich states against less developed states, right? So we have colonialism, which caused massive problems in especially Africa. You have the slave trade, right? You have mercantilism, which was about resource extraction and enriching, rich states. And then you also have restrictions on land ownership, education, access to capital, and resource extraction, right? And these sorts of things kept the indigenous populations often in very, very low positions, which has been perpetuated over time. You also have war and political instability, which can cause massive disruptions in economics and can cause poverty and inequality. We know that war tends to ravage economies and infrastructure, which is vital to the success of a nation. So, if you look at countries like Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, they all came out very poor. But I would also point out that the U.S. Saw issues with growing inequality and poverty because when they were at war with Iraq and Afghanistan, because of the massive expenditures on military rather than the domestic population, right? This is the guns versus butter argument. And I would also point out Russia today, right? Russia was not exactly a strong economy before they invaded Ukraine in 2014 and then again in 2022. But it is becoming dramatically worse, right? Inflation is rising, unemployment is rising. There are hundreds of thousands of injured or dead young men. And so there is a growing frustration in Russia as well. Another problem is structural economic conditions, right? So the World Bank and the IMF, what happens often is the World Bank or the IMF will offer loans to countries at, with you have to pay back a particular interest rate. Um, the problem, though, is that oftentimes either this money is corruptly stolen or spent inefficiently, or the World Bank and IMF put what are called structural adjustments on these countries and say, all right, you have to reduce social spending in these ways. You have to privatize your utility companies in these ways. You have to institute austerity measures and reduce, spending on infrastructure, education, all these sorts of things. So this has caused a lot of frustration in sort of the second and third level nations around the world. Okay, section 3, measuring and reducing poverty. There are a lot of different ways that we've approached this over the contemporaneous period, the last 50 or 60 years. First, you have official development assistance or just plain aid, right? Unfortunately, this has been far from entirely successful and can even make things worse. Why might it make things worse to give aid to a foreign country? First, you could get just plain inappropriate aid, right? Uh, there was an example in the book where they gave a nation ventilators, but they didn't have electricity. So how the hell are you going to use that? Or they could give them military equipment that's not really helpful for the domestic population. You also have high levels of corruption and theft, and this helps to sort of keep strong men in power. It also ensures that a nation doesn't have to worry about development so that they can get tax resources if they're just getting free money. And if you don't have to worry about tax resources and keeping your citizens happy, then you can just abuse or exploit them or whatever, right? We also have aid as proxy war, right? So During the Cold War, we would give aid, especially for military or technological assistance, to those countries that were ideologically aligned with the U.S., and Russia would do the same on the other side, right? And so it often caused conflict, and as we talked about above, we know that conflict is detrimental to economic growth. Ukraine today is another example of proxy wars, right? Russia and Ukraine are battling outright. However, the West and NATO generally are supporting Ukraine through a proxy, and then China and North Korea are supporting Russia on the other side through proxies. And then finally, we talked about structural adjustments above with the IMF and the World Bank, but often privatization of utilities can make them less functional and less affordable, right? So if you privatize your electricity grid, then they may not reinvest in the grid. They may raise costs, which means that people can't actually get electricity, these sorts of things, right? And that can cause further poverty and inequality. Let's see, trade and investment are also important, right? Foreign direct investment is when, say, the United States builds a factory in China or Japan or Egypt, I don't know, right? This is a mixed bag. Sometimes it can do really good things for that country, especially because those foreign direct investments often require a building out of infrastructure to get to ports, to transport goods, these sorts of things, which can be very helpful. It also leads, free trade has also been good for some and not for everyone, right? And then they didn't really mention in the book, but I would point out there were two different directions, sort of post World War II, that two different areas of the globe went through. One was called import substitution industrialization. This is called ISI, import substitution industrialization. This is the route that much of Africa and Latin America went through. The idea here was to take massive expenditures from the government to build up strategically chosen industries. And so, like, I'll use Brazil as an example. Brazil wanted to be able to build out their own industries in medium to high level manufactured goods. So think microwaves, refrigerators, all the way up to cars, planes, etc. Um, the problem with this, however, is that these these industries were protected massively, right, through tariffs, trade barriers. They're also being fed billions of dollars in government funding. So they didn't have any incentive to keep up with the global industry. They didn't have any incentive to innovate, to be efficient, right? Because the government is just feeding them money. And so, for the most part, ISI completely failed, right? If you look at Brazil, Brazil did not do well with ISI. Many of these companies eventually collapsed. They could not build a decent car. They couldn't compete in the international market. And they didn't innovate, all of these problems, right? On the other end of the spectrum is called export oriented industrialization, EOI instead of ISI. So the best example of this sort of approach is the Asian approach, right? So China, South Korea, Japan, etc. Uh, Instead of trying to protect domestic industries, they promoted trade and growth in some pretty interesting ways, right? So just like Brazil, they wanted to be able to build out medium and then eventually high level manufactured products. However, instead of protecting their own industries and force feeding them money and keeping alternative products from the global scene off of their markets, they promoted export, right? And this incentivized innovation, uh, reinvestment in technology, all of these sorts of things. And so, if you sort of look at the last 50 years and these two different approaches by the second and third level countries in the world, um, the vast majority of economists, theorists, etc., say that ISI was sort of a crippling failure, and EOI, export oriented industrialization, has been a massive success. If you look at states like South Korea, China, Japan. South Korea used to be one of the poorest countries on the planet. And within 50 years, they are one of the richest and most educated countries on the planet, right? Okay. We talked earlier about money lending and how money lending can actually sort of cripple an economy instead of helping it. It can lead to massive debt and a spiral of borrowing or default, right? And so this is what we saw during the Asian currency crisis of 1997. This is also what we saw in Argentina during the 2000s, where they defaulted on their loans. Um, they got what was called no, what was it called? They got this flooding out of investments, right? All of these investments that had been put into Argentina, the moment they defaulted on their loans, all of these investments flooded out of their country. Their currency collapsed. Inflation kicked in. It was a huge mess, right? The last thing I want to mention in this chapter is the Millennium Development Goals. This was a pretty famous project from the UN led by an economist named Jeffrey Sachs. I think he taught at Harvard and University of Chicago. And it had 7 or 8 different goals, right? The eradication of extreme hunger and poverty, the achievement of universal primary education, the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women in the marketplace, which we know is really powerful for boosting an economy, the reduction of child mortality, the improvement of maternal health, the combating of HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, etc., ensuring environmental sustainability, and developing global partnerships for development. And so, one of our questions will also be on these Millennium Development Goals. Okay, that's all I've got for you on this one. Thanks for being here and have a great day.